Our first speaker for this morning is Mr Peter Yu, who is Chairman of the Northern Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance. Peter is a Yawuru man from Broome in the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia. He has over 30 years' experience at the state, national and international level. For his entire career, he has been an advocate for the social, cultural and economic advancement of Kimberley communities and other Aboriginal communities around Australia. He was Executive Director of the Kimberley Land Council during the 1990s and had a national leadership role in negotiating Australia's national response to the High Court's 1992 Mabo decision, which of course, as we know, then became the National Native Title Act. He is a partner with Stellar Corporate Solutions and an independent chair of the Northern Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance, NALSMA, a company seeking innovation and practical solutions to land use management practices using traditional knowledge systems and Western science. Please put your hands together for Peter Yu.
Najigurian Ngayu ya romba Ngayu ngambulan rubi ya ngamba yaringan kaniburu Kalni nganyan guri Ngarungu gara yaringan gurji mabu nyanga. How are you all? And as Melissa has indicated, I'm from Broome in the Kimberleys. I'm a Yawuru man. And I greet you all, and we as Aboriginal people give you this good word, hopefully. Can I, first of all, before I give my presentation on the way, I was very fortunate enough to meet the Dalai Lama some years ago, and one of the key messages that he indicated was Australia is a very young country, and we should shine our own light in the world and not be constrained by the nature of the politics, of the economics, but to seek our own path. But importantly, as Aboriginal peoples, to use our own name. You notice I referred to my notes in terms of my Yawuru introduction to you today, because when we grew up, we were discouraged from speaking our language and forcibly coerced into not speaking our language. But it's never too late to learn. And I feel like I'm standing right in the middle of a football field with this big space here in front of you all. But can I first of all acknowledge the Larrakia people, the traditional owners of this country, and for their gracious welcome and for allowing us to be here. It's an important time in contemporary Australia at the moment, because we had the National Sorry Day on Sunday, and Michael Long, who's from up this way, he started his long walk from Melbourne on that day on Sunday and working his way up, I believe, all the way up through the centre of Australia to Gama, just to draw to the attention, both nationally and internationally, the ongoing plight and situation of Australia's First Peoples. But it's also National Reconciliation Week. So it's quite apt that this discussion, this international discussion, should be happening about this time in this country. But let me also acknowledge the co-chairs, Melissa and Chasky, for their welcome. Can I acknowledge my other colleagues from the Kimberleys, the men and women, the people who have travelled from overseas to be here, and importantly, the people who actually get their hands dirty and do all the necessary work that's required on the ground, the Land and Sea Rangers. It's a great honour and privilege to be asked to provide this address to you today. Because this is a very important conference, these opportunities to consider issues from a global Indigenous perspective are very rare. regardless of the circumstances that Indigenous people find themselves with nation states. We have a connection that is universal. Indigenous peoples' links to our physical environments, our non-linear perspective on life, and our shared history of surviving colonisation gives us a status as Indigenous peoples within the totality of world humanity. It is timely that this conference is happening in Northern Australia. This region is on the cusp of significant economic development because of the Asian and global demand for energy and for food. And I'm sure that while I focus I tend to the matters that relate to particular issues that confront us here in Northern Australia, I'm sure that it'll resonate with other groups and our other visitors from overseas. Northern Australia has global significance because it's one of the few non-desert mega landscapes on Earth where traditional Indigenous societies and their physical environments had survived relatively intact. Northern Australia is at a transformative point of history and facing existential questions about its future. Does it follow the established Western economic development model that has seen wealth created at a huge cost of Indigenous cultural and environmental destruction? Or does it embark on a new paradigm that sees wealth generation and cultural and environmental sustainability as indivisible and integrated? We know the forces driving economic growth are fed from historical experiences. The history of Western economic expansion is about conquering, colonising and subjugating Indigenous peoples to the new order. The overt brutality of earlier colonisation periods have given way to more nuanced methods of Western domination. But the essence of the established Western paradigm remains fundamentally the same. Indigenous culture and our people's occupation of the land and seas are treated by political and economic elites as a problem to overcome so that wealth can be generated to benefit them. Moral qualms arising from this approach are obfuscated through notions that benefits somehow trickle down to the colonised through the overwhelming evidence, although the overwhelming evidence paints a different picture. The pervasive historical consequences of Indigenous people from Western economic intervention has not been pretty. World history tells a familiar story. The impact on Indigenous societies from Western domination has been conflict and the horrendous cumulative consequences of living as marginalised people under imposed control, poverty, despair, poor health, relentless grief, mass incarceration and widespread violence. When the truth of history is known, modern societies has a moral imperative to avoid repeating past injustices. There is a sense of urgency to build a new paradigm for Northern Australian development, where Indigenous peoples and their cultures are not only respected, but also embraced as valid partners in regional development. We are already seeing the economic development pressures in the north. A recent snapshot of the mining leases currently held in Northern Australia suggests that we are on the cusp of mining developments never before witnessed. And I wish I had actually put a map in there because I think you'd be interested to see just how widespread that is, both from an onshore and offshore point of view. I always say that we're kind of blessed and cursed with having every known resource to mankind in the Kimberleys, and I would suspect that's probably across the entire north of Australia. And the challenges that brings to us is something that is very much front and centre in regards to our ability and capacities to address our response to that. The INPEX LNG developments and the early stage industrialisation of Darwin Harbour is a taste of what's to come and what to expect. With huge reserves of offshore and onshore gas and a serious push to use northern waters for food production, there is compelling evidence that the next wave of northern development will be real and transformative. This, of course, is within the context of what we've had here in Australia the last, I'm not sure exactly, but probably about the last 6-7 years under this government and the previous government, under the Northern Water Task Force, the investigation of water resources and the development capacities that might be contained therein. Together, of course, with the recent released paper by Ken Henry on the Asian Century White Paper and the positioning of Northern Australia within the context of growing and developing relationship with China and India particularly. Northern Australian development scenarios must factor in a fundamental premise, and that is that Aboriginal people are the most important social, cultural, economic and political feature of this region. We are the overwhelming majority of the permanent population of this region. Outside the city of Darwin, there are only a handful of urban centres in the whole of Northern Australia which have a majority non-Indigenous population. Hundreds of other population settlements, both mainstream towns and discrete Indigenous communities, are dominated by Indigenous people, and this is set to increase. Over a huge landscape stretching from more than 5,000 kilometres between Cairns on the Pacific Ocean seaboard, on the eastern seaboard, to Broome on the Indian Ocean coast, Indigenous communities directly own over 40% of the land and have a common law coexisting rights to most of the rest. This demographic, legal landholding data is an unambiguous reality of Northern Australia. Added to this are thousands of generations of traditional wisdom, language, knowledge and spiritual connection to practically every square inch of the region, which makes Northern Australia very much an Indigenous domain. When considering a new paradigm for Northern Australian development, people who possess political and economic power must extinguish from their consciousness a fundamental belief that Indigenous peoples are opposed to economic development. This pervasive view impedes the development of a transparent relationship between Indigenous people, industries and governments. It is because of this view that governments are reluctant to empower traditional owners with the tools for effective governance, fearing that they may create a monster which will resist development proposals. This view that Aboriginal peoples are opposed to economic development often results in government and industry engaging Indigenous interests with suspicion and lack of openness. As a consequence, and by default, government and industry often employ manipulative and divide and conquer strategies to achieve their development objectives. In their wake, Indigenous communities are often left divided and suspicious of development proposals. And often what is achieved is a self-fulfilling prophecy on the part of government industry that Indigenous peoples are opposed to development. And so the everlasting story continues. As chairman of NALSMA, our organisation deals with communities throughout Northern Australia, and I strongly believe that Indigenous people want to engage in a paradigm of development and wealth creation in a manner that brings reliability, that develops resilience, and ultimately is sustainable. By sustainable, I mean that economic development should assist Indigenous peoples to live on their country and support traditional culture and not erode it. Many may think that economic development projects, particularly those involving extractive resource development or horticulture development, must be by nature destructive to both Indigenous culture and our natural environment. There is a school of thought which argues that Indigenous futures belongs to the new emerging economy based on investments in traditional land management practices to mitigate carbon pollution or cultural and environmental tourism, or other aspects of Indigenous society, such as traditional knowledge relating to health and artistic creativity. NAILSMA is a strong believer in this future, and we are investing in various initiatives to support traditional landowning groups to grow this emerging economy. We see the growth of the emerging cultural economy as a basis to enable Indigenous people to live on their traditional country and infuse Indigenous values in Northern Australia's economic and political fabric. However, it is important to be realistic and appreciate that for many years to come, the old extractive and environmentally exploitative industries will dominate Northern Australia's overall economy. Indigenous people cannot afford to see the old economy and the new economy as mutually exclusive. Indigenous engagement in the old economy is fundamentally important to create income and to grow the new economy. And for instance, the world-class pioneering traditional fire management initiative in West Arnhem Land, the WAFA project, would not be possible without the partnership with the ConocoPhillips, who assist to underwrite that project and who are, but also at the same time, refining LNG in Darwin Harbour. But for this engagement to be effective, measured by equitable and sustainable outcomes, there must be a new paradigm for this Northern Australian development. And for the remainder of this presentation, I would like to scope out three fundamental integrated elements that I think should frame a new paradigm to development in the North. In doing so, I'm informed by the innovative and creative thinking of more than 100 Indigenous leaders recently, entrepreneurs and land management practitioners who met recently here in the Northern Territory at Kakadu National Park at a forum that was convened by NAILSMA to discuss how Indigenous people should respond to the challenges and opportunities of Northern Australian development. The first element is governance. The capacity of traditional owners to make decisions about development proposals on their country. Although there has been extensive dialogue about Indigenous governance in recent years, there has been little change in the institutional arrangements to enable traditional owners to make informed decisions about developments that impact on us and to negotiate participation and engagement in the economic forces that surround Indigenous societies. This is a matter that government and industry have failed to take seriously, preferring a state of dysfunctionality of localised Indigenous groups being disempowered and therefore relying on large land councils and other external agents to represent traditional owners in negotiations over economic development scenarios. Traditional owner-based ranger groups across Northern Australia and prescribed body corporates that emerge from native title determinations, of which there are a growing number, is where effort must go to strengthen Northern governance, together with ensuring the ongoing collaboration and support of the larger regional bodies. This would enable more local groups to have a direct relationship and would reduce transaction costs and bring greater efficiencies and returns to the investors in Northern development. We must not be afraid to confront this necessary change. The challenges that we face are bigger than the nature of our parochial interests. We have to be up to the challenge and be prepared to move outside the rhetorical framework of past arguments and reasons for not accepting this challenge. The fundamentals of the change confronting us are so dramatic and drastic in their capacity to alter the landscape quite immediately that unless we as Aboriginal people and our organisations are prepared to engage and to own the risk and to confront those challenges in owning those risks, to understand what those risks are, so that we're able collectively and collaboratively to mitigate against those risks, then we risk exactly what the forces that may not and aren't sympathetic to our interests would seek to happen to us into the future. That is the critical challenge, I think, that we face collectively as Indigenous peoples, as First Peoples across the northern part of this country. The second and related element is the critical factor of obtaining informed Indigenous consent. Along with practically every other nation state on earth, Australia has signed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yet we have yet to see some domestic ratification of that within the legal structures of this land. The Declaration highlights the importance of gaining Indigenous peoples free, prior and informed consent for development proposals or policies that impact on Indigenous peoples. For legal security, as well as long-term social cohesion, it is critical that this principle is properly implemented under the transparent processes. It means that Indigenous governance must be properly structured so that Indigenous decision-making is thoroughly mandated by the community and by the members, who must have access and be able to comprehend all of the relevant information pertaining to an economic development proposal, including environmental, social and cultural impacts, both positive and negative, commercial, financial, and of course native title. Related to governance and informed consent procedures is Indigenous people's capacity to negotiate agreements that incorporate Indigenous engagement in the society that is being transformed by the proposed development. The third element of the new development paradigm will require serious investment by Aboriginal interests, third parties and governments to build an evidence-based framework that will both inform the content of agreement and measure the intended outcomes. Two areas of this framework that received some attention at the Kakadu Forum was, in practical terms, was the GIS mapping and development of a wellbeing index. Some native title groups such as mines, the Yaru in the Broome region, we're developing geospatial mapping technology that combines Indigenous knowledge and practical observations with Western scientific data. The development of comprehensive maps will help planning and decision-making regarding development and demonstrate to all parties where development can and cannot proceed. The development of a wellbeing measure, which our senior cultural leader Patrick Dodson has described as an Indigenous Resilience Index, has the potential to show what investments is required and where to mitigate the impacts of development on Indigenous societies. In partnership with government, the Indigenous Resilient Index approach as the fundamental, as the potential to change the relationship between Indigenous peoples, industries and governments, so that the notion of equitable partnership becomes dominant themes in resetting the relationship rather than contested and begrudging compensation. In conclusion, if the Australian nation does not engage in a dialogue about developing a new paradigm for Northern Australia, for the development of this region, then the region is destined to be embroiled in conflict that will inevitably lead to social discord and economic underdevelopment. We have seen a recent example in the Broome region about how development proposals should not be managed. Northern Australia and the people who live here should not be subject to these destructive approaches by government and industry. A new paradigm, as I have outlined, can be developed through clever investments and a determination to build goodwill. A mature nation informed by the wisdom of history should have the capacity to forge a different future in Northern Australia to that experienced elsewhere over the past 2 centuries. Galamabu.